How would building a nuclear power plant in New South Wales affect the environment? New South Wales is using coal to produce 80% of its electricity. Coal is readily available and is relatively easy and cheap to turn into electricity. However, coal-fired generators pollute the air and damage the environment when they release greenhouse gases. In an international agreement called the Kyoto Protocol, Australia has committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Since electricity generation is the biggest contributor to emissions and coal is the largest electricity supplier, it makes sense that we should find an alternative to coal. But the government expects to keep using coal and for emissions from electricity to increase, not decrease. But why? Renewables such as hydro, solar and wind currently don't generate enough electricity to provide a reliable base supply. Another alternative is nuclear power. But the majority of popular opinion in Australia is that nuclear power is expensive, unsafe, produces nuclear waste which we can't store safely, and risks nuclear weapons proliferation. But what are the facts? Here's what I've learned. Nuclear reactors work in a similar way to coal-fired generators. Both use heat to turn water into steam, which turns a turbine to generate electricity. The main difference is how the heat is produced. Coal-fired generators burn coal to produce heat, but in a nuclear reactor, the heat is produced from a nuclear reaction called fission. Nuclear reactors produce waste products that are highly radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years and need to be stored safely to prevent contamination. However, they produce near-zero greenhouse gas emissions, even when taking into account the whole life cycle. There have been three major, highly publicised disasters, including 3 Mile Island in 1979, Chernobyl in 1986, and Fukushima in 2011, when a tsunami struck the nuclear power plant, destroying the power systems needed to cool the reactor. This resulted in fuel melting, hydrogen explosions, and radioactive release. Up to 100,000 people were evacuated to avoid radioactive contamination. No immediate deaths were caused, but an increased risk of cancer and other long-term health effects are possible. Even when taking into account these huge disasters, nuclear power still only produces 1/100th of the deaths caused by the coal industry. Australia already has a nuclear reactor operating in Lucas Heights, New South Wales, which is used for research and medical treatments. However, it is illegal to use nuclear power for domestic electricity production in Australia. Research is currently being done in Japan, Canada, France, India and China into liquid fluoride thorium reactors, or lifters, which use thorium instead of uranium. Thorium is 4 times more abundant in the world than uranium, and a very small amount of thorium produces a high output of energy. Lifters produce very little plutonium, which is used to make nuclear weapons, so the risk of proliferation is extremely low. Lifters produce 300 times less waste than uranium reactors, and instead of needing to be stored for hundreds of thousands of years, after just 500 years, the waste produced from a lifter is less radioactive than the original ore mined. There is no risk of a meltdown with a lifter because the fuel is already in a liquid state. If there was an earthquake like in Fukushima, the fuel would simply drain into the emergency dump tank and cool. So, what should we do? In a conference which posed the question, Nuclear Energy for Australia, acknowledged topic experts met together and debated various aspects of adopting nuclear power in Australia. The conclusion they reached was that there is no reason that nuclear power should not be carefully considered as part of Australia's long-term generation portfolio. The main obstacle identified was public acceptance. They recommended open, informed public debate and consultation with members of the community. We should educate ourselves about nuclear power and weigh it up against the alternatives. By thinking logically and critically about our decisions, we can create a sustainable future for the future generations.